Atlanta, Valentine's Day, 7:15 in the evening. A man in dirty work clothes sits alone at a diner counter with $18 in his pocket and nowhere to be. Behind him, a woman in a red dress is trying very hard not to fall apart. She just told a stranger about her dying brother. The stranger stood up and walked out. Left $60 on the table like that settled something. The man at the counter heard every word. He sits there. Coffee going cold. Bus already gone, he should leave. He doesn't. He picks up his mug, sets it down, and then slowly, without anyone asking him to, he stands up, turns around, and walks across the room toward a woman he has never met. What happens next will cost him everything he has, and give him everything he never knew he was missing. Calvin Reed had exactly $18 in his wallet. Not $18 and some change. Not $18 waiting to become 20. Just 18. A 10 and a 5 and 3 singles that were soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. He knew the exact amount because he had counted it twice that morning, in the parking lot of the auto shop, before his shift started. 12 hours ago. Back when the day still felt manageable. That was before the transmission on the Escalade stripped out completely, and took 2 hours longer than it should have. Before the parts supplier delivered the wrong rotors for the third job in a row. Before Calvin's own truck, his truck, the one he had rebuilt from the frame up 6 years ago, the one that had never given him a single day of trouble, decided that Valentine's Day was the perfect evening to lose power steering fluid all over the concrete floor of Bay 3 and strand him 3 blocks from the nearest bus stop. Valentine's Day. Of all the days. He was still in his work clothes when he pushed through the door of Marigold Diner. Dark green coveralls with his name stitched in yellow thread over the left chest pocket. Grease under his fingernails that no amount of the orange hand cleaner at the shop sink ever fully got out. Boots that had seen 6 years of shop floors and were not embarrassed about it. He probably treat them with kindness. He probably should have cared about that. Probably should have felt something about walking into a restaurant full of couples in their Valentine's best, while he looked like he had just climbed out from underneath a vehicle, which he had. He did not care. He just needed somewhere warm to sit for 23 minutes until the Route 12 came through. The hostess, a young woman with a headset, and the particular exhaustion of someone working a holiday shift, looked at him. Looked at the waiting area full of people in dresses and blazers, and then looked back at him. He said, "Just the counter." She looked relieved. The counter at Marigold ran the full length of the back wall, red vinyl stools bolted to the floor, the kind of diner counter that had been there since before either of them was born. Calvin took the stool second from the end and set his phone face up on the laminate. The bus came at 7:48. He had until then. The waitress came over with a coffee pot and a look that said she was 40 minutes into a double and not interested in small talk. Calvin appreciated that. "Just coffee," he said. She poured and moved on. $2.50 for the coffee. Left him $15.50. He wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat move through his palms and up into the muscles of his forearms and just sat there, not thinking about anything in particular. Not thinking about Zara away at school in Savannah. Not thinking about the truck sitting dead in the shop parking lot that he would have to figure out tomorrow. Not thinking about the fact that it was Valentine's Day and he was a 42-year-old man, drinking a $2 coffee alone at a diner counter with grease under his fingernails and absolutely nowhere to be. He was very specifically not thinking about any of that. The diner was full, every booth taken. The booths along the window were mostly couples, the kind of couples who made reservations somewhere in October and ended up at Marigold because the reservation fell through. There were a few family tables near the back. A group of older women near the door who had clearly decided that Valentine's Day belonged to them as much as anyone and were celebrating accordingly, loudly, with what appeared to be a considerable amount of sweet tea. Calvin watched the room in the way he had always watched rooms, quietly, without appearing to watch at all. His mother had called it his owl look. You just sit there and you see everything and you don't let on that you see anything. Useful quality in a mechanic. You could diagnose a problem before you ever opened the hood, if you just paid attention to the right things. He was paying attention to his coffee when the door opened. He did not look up right away. He heard it, the cold air that came in with it, the brief swell of street noise, the sound of heels on the tile floor. Then something made him look. He could not have said what, exactly. Just something in the rhythm of it. The way the sound of those heels changed slightly when they hit the diner floor, not slowing down, but adjusting. She was tall. That was the first thing. Not runway tall, not distracting tall, but the kind of tall that meant she was used to walking into rooms and being seen whether she wanted to be or not. She wore a red dress, not a bright fire truck red, but something deeper, like the color of a pomegranate, fitted from the shoulders down past her knees. Tasted silk press, the kind that took time and intention, hair falling past her shoulders in dark waves that caught the light when she moved. Her face was Calvin made himself stop looking, which was difficult because her face was the kind of face that made stopping difficult. High cheekbones, a mouth that was set in a line that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Eyes that were scanning the room the way his eyes scanned rooms, looking for something or someone. She was also gripping her clutch bag slightly too hard. Calvin noticed that too. The way her fingers were white-knuckled around that little black purse, even though the rest of her looked composed. That one detail. That was the tell. She was nervous. She spotted an open booth on the near side of the diner and slid into it with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes on her phone immediately. Checking. Rechecking. The posture of someone who has told themselves they are fine and is currently in the process of maintaining that story through sheer willpower. Calvin turned back to his coffee. None of his business. He had 7 minutes before the bus. He was 3 sips into convincing himself to stop noticing things when the door opened again and a man came in, and Calvin did not need to look at him long to understand everything. The suit was charcoal gray. The shoes were the kind that got shined by someone else. The watch was not expensive in a way that needed to announce itself because it did not need to. The man's name, according to the voice that said it across the diner, with the comfortable volume of someone accustomed to being heard, Deja. Just the one word. And the way he said it already had an answer built into it. The answer was, I've done this before. I'm good at this. This is one of several evenings I have planned. The woman in the red dress looked up from her phone, and her face did the thing faces do when they are performing a feeling rather than having it. Corners of the mouth up, eyes making the right shape, a brightness that was constructed on the spot and held together with intention. Troy. A pause. Good to meet you. Calvin watched them greet each other in his peripheral vision, and then looked back at the window and the dark street outside and the headlights going past and decided, firmly, that he was going to spend the next 6 minutes thinking about the truck's power steering issue. He managed about 4 minutes. Not because he was trying to listen. The booths at Marigold backed directly up to the counter with no real barrier between them, just the architecture of a 60-year-old diner that had not been designed with anyone's privacy in mind. He could hear them as clearly as if they were sitting next to him. The small talk first. Jobs. Troy's in finance, something in acquisitions. He said it the way people say things when they are used to those words opening doors. Deja was a nurse. Grady Memorial. She said that the way people say things when they know it won't open the same doors, but they're past caring about that. Then Troy said, your profile mentioned family. Do you have siblings or? And Deja's voice shifted. Just slightly. The construction dropped about 6 inches. I have an older brother, Elijah. He's 41. A pause. He's been sick. He has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I moved in with him about 14 months ago to help with his care. Calvin's hands went still around his mug. A silence from the booth that lasted long enough to have a shape. Then Troy said, so you're basically a full-time caregiver. He's my brother, Deja said. So yes, and the nursing shifts are on top of that. I work nights when I can, so I can be home during the day. Another silence, shorter this time, the kind of silence that is actually a decision being made. Troy said, I have to be honest with you. Calvin closed his eyes. You're clearly an incredible person. What you're doing for your brother that takes real strength. I respect it genuinely. A beat. But I'm not looking for something this complicated right now. You're not looking for a partner. You're looking for someone to share a burden, and I can't be that person. That's not fair to either of us. Deja did not say anything. I hope you understand it's not about you personally. A sound of movement, fabric against vinyl, the soft thud of money being laid on a table. Take care of yourself, Deja. I mean that. And then the sound of those good shoes on the tile floor, moving toward the door. And then the cold air again. And then nothing. Calvin sat there. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he usually wasn't. Steady, loud. He was aware of the fact that his jaw had gone tight at some point during that conversation and had not unclenched. He was aware of the fact that the woman in the red dress was now sitting alone in a booth behind him on Valentine's Day, after telling a stranger about her dying brother and being told politely that this made her inconvenient. He thought about Zara at 16, sitting in a hospital waiting room in a purple jacket she had worn because purple was her mother's favorite color, being told by a doctor who was careful and kind and professional that her mother was not coming home, and how Calvin had sat next to his daughter, and held her hand, and felt the walls of every room he had ever known press in, until there was almost no air left. And how the only thing that had made it possible to keep breathing, was that somebody was there, right there, not fixing it, not explaining it, just present. He thought about the years after that, the learning to be one person instead of two, the learning to make school lunches and talk about feelings and navigate a daughter's adolescence. Without the person who had always known exactly what to say. He thought about all the nights he had sat alone in his kitchen after Zara went to bed and felt the specific weight of a quiet that used to be full. He knew what it felt like when people decided you were too much to deal with and walked away. He knew it in his body. He uncurled his fingers from the mug, put his phone in his pocket, stood up and walked to the booth. She had her face in her hands, not theatrical crying, not the loud kind. The quiet kind, which is always worse, because the quiet kind is what happens when you have been crying long enough that your body has learned to do it without making a scene. He said, "I'm sorry to bother you." She looked up. Her eyes were wet and her mascara had come down just slightly at the outer corners, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts mortification and exhaustion. "I was sitting at the counter," he said. "I didn't mean to hear all of that, but I did." He stopped, restarted. That man was wrong, not just in what he decided, in how he said it. "You didn't deserve that." She stared at him. He stuck out his hand. It was not a clean hand. He was aware of that. "Calvin," he said, "I'm a mechanic. My truck broke down tonight, which is embarrassing given what I do for a living, so I'm waiting on the bus. I don't want anything. I just didn't want you to sit here alone after that." She looked at his hand for a moment, then she shook it. "Dija," she said. Her voice was steady. Not because she was steady, because she had practiced making her voice steady when she wasn't. "You really didn't have to do this." "I know," he said. "Can I sit for a minute?" She looked at him for a long moment. The way you look at something when you are trying to figure out which category it belongs in, and none of the categories you have are quite fitting. Then she moved her clutch bag to make room. He sat down. The waitress came over with the coffee pot and an expression that did not ask any questions, which Calvin appreciated, and filled Dija's cup and looked at him, and he said yes, and she filled his too. He said, "You don't have to talk. I'll just sit here until my bus comes, if that's okay." Deja looked at her coffee. "When does your bus come?" 7:48. She looked at her phone. "That's 10 minutes. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was the third one." Calvin waited. "In 6 months. The third man who decided my life was too complicated." She was not crying anymore. She had moved past it into something flatter. "My friend Kezia keeps telling me I need to put myself out there." She made the profile. She picked the photos. A short exhale that was not quite a laugh. She meant well. "Friends who mean well are their own kind of exhausting," Calvin said. Deja looked at him for the first time with something other than wariness. "Yeah," she said, "they really are." 7:48 came and went. Calvin did not get up. He would not fully understand why until much later. At the time it just felt like the most obvious thing, that getting up and leaving was the wrong thing to do in a way he could feel in his chest. And he had learned over years of doing a job that required listening to sounds that other people couldn't hear, that when something felt wrong in your chest, you paid attention to it. So he stayed, and Deja talked. Not all at once, not in a rush. The way people talk when they have been not talking for a very long time and suddenly there is someone in front of them who is not flinching. She talked about Elijah, about the diagnosis 14 months ago, stage 4, pancreatic, inoperable, about how the doctor had used the word aggressive, and she had understood immediately, because she was a nurse, and she had sat in rooms with families and used that word herself, and she had always known what it meant. But knowing a word professionally, and having it applied to your only brother, are two experiences that share nothing except the letters. She talked about giving up her apartment, moving her life, her furniture, her plans, her entire daily architecture into Elijah's place, so she could be there when he needed her, which was becoming more hours of the day, and fewer that he didn't. She talked about the hospice nurse who came 3 times a week, a woman named Beverly, who had seen everything and could still make Elijah laugh, which Deja said was the most valuable skill she had ever witnessed in another human being. She talked about Elijah himself, about the way he played jazz piano before his hands started shaking, about his laugh, about the way he had always been the one who made every room warmer just by being in it, about how she had followed him around for most of her childhood, like he was proof that the world could be good, and how she was not entirely sure what she believed about the world without him in it. And Calvin listened. He did not try to fix it, did not offer the things people usually offered, the silver linings, the "it happens for a reasons," the "at least he's not sufferings." He just listened the way he listened to engines, completely, without waiting for his turn to speak. At some point he told her about his wife, not in detail, just the shape of it. Her name was Gloria. She had been 40 when she died. An aneurysm. One morning she woke up and complained of a headache, and by noon she was gone. And by evening Calvin was sitting in a hospital corridor being told by a kind doctor that sometimes these things happen without warning, and there was nothing anyone could have done, and he should call someone if he could. Did he have someone to call? He had called his mother. His mother had driven 3 hours and taken one look at him, and said nothing at all, and just put her arms around him and held on. And that had been the right thing, and he had remembered it ever since, the value of not saying anything when there is nothing to say. He told her about Zara, about raising a daughter alone on a mechanic's salary in Atlanta, about the school plays he had attended in his work clothes because there was no time to go home first and change, and Zara had never once made him feel bad about it, about how his daughter was 22 now, studying graphic design in Savannah, already better at knowing her own mind than Calvin had been at 35, about how the thing that scared him the most when Gloria died was not the grief. He understood grief. Grief was just love with nowhere to go. His mother had told him that, and it was true. What scared him was that he might forget how to be a person who let other people in, that the long practice of being alone would calcify into something permanent. Deja listened to that the same way he had listened to her, without offering anything, without rushing to fill the space. Around 9:30 she looked at the time and made a small sound. I should get back. Beverly leaves at 10 and Elijah doesn't sleep well if I'm not there. Calvin nodded. He did not say anything about the bus. He had long since missed the last Route 12. He was going to call an Uber with 11 of his remaining $15.50, and he was not sorry about it. They stood at the counter while he paid. He would not let her pay for herself. She looked at the money he put down, exact change, because he had counted it, and she started to say something, and he shook his head. I know, he said, sit. Let me do this one thing. She looked at him for a long moment in the light of the diner that was now quieter. The Valentine's couples thinning out, the older women near the door, finishing the last of their sweet tea. Thank you, she said. Not just for the coffee. For staying. I didn't have anywhere else to be, he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. But it was enough for now. He walked out into the cold Atlanta night and stood on the sidewalk and pulled out his phone to call the car, and stood there for a moment not doing it. Just standing. The street was mostly quiet. Somewhere 2 blocks over someone was playing music from a car window, something slow and warm that floated up into the February air and disappeared. He thought about what she had said about the third man in 6 months. The third person who had looked at her life, her full, complicated, costly, real life, and decided it was more than they signed up for. He thought about Troy Okafor in his charcoal suit, laying $60 on a table and walking out. He thought about what kind of man does that. And then, which surprised him more, he thought about what kind of man doesn't. He called the car and went home. He could not sleep. Not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation for him since Gloria died, something he could usually arrive at eventually but never on schedule. He lay in the dark of the bedroom that had been theirs, and was now only his, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Deja's voice when she talked about Elijah, not the words, the quality of it. The way it went careful in certain places. The way a person goes careful when they are talking about something they are holding very gently because they know exactly how breakable it is. He picked up his phone and looked at the time, 10:47. He put the phone down. He thought about calling Zara. Checked himself it was a school night, and Zara had an 8 o'clock studio critique in the morning, and would answer anyway and feel guilty about being tired. He put that thought back. His phone lit up, unknown number. He looked at it for 1 ring, 2, and picked up. Her voice came through before he had finished saying hello, quiet, tight. I'm sorry to call this late. A pause. This is Deja. From the diner. I'm not sure why I'm calling, She stopped. Elijah's having a rough night. Beverly left at 10 and I gave him the meds and they're not quite, he's uncomfortable and I'm sitting here and I just needed to. Another stop. I don't know, I'm sorry. This was strange. I shouldn't have told me about him, Calvin said. Silence. Who is Elijah when he's not in pain? Tell me something he would want you to tell. A very long pause. Long enough that he thought maybe he had said the wrong thing. Long enough that he started to form an apology. Then she started talking. She told him about the time Elijah learned to play John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, all the way through for the first time, and played it 3 times in a row at 2 in the morning in their childhood apartment. and their mother had come out in her robe and stood in the hallway listening and been so angry and so proud at the same time that she couldn't find a single word for either feeling. She told him about the road trip they had taken together when Deja was 24. Just the two of them, from Atlanta to Chicago in Elijah's old Buick, with no air conditioning and one working window, and a playlist that was mostly Elijah's and a little bit hers. She told him about how Elijah cried at every movie, every single one, without exception, and had zero shame about it, and would hand you a tissue before you realized you needed one. She told him about the way Elijah said her name, how he was the only person in the world who said Deja like it was a complete sentence, like it meant exactly what it was supposed to mean, and nothing needed to be added. Calvin listened to all of it, every word. He was lying on his side in the dark with the phone against his ear, and outside the February wind moved through the oak tree in the backyard, and he listened and did not speak and did not need to. She talked for almost 2 hours. At some point Elijah's meds evened out and he slept. She could tell by the change in her own breathing, the way the tightness around her words loosened slightly when she was no longer listening for sounds in the other room. Around 1 she said, "I think he's okay now. I think I kept you up for 2 hours." "I was already up," Calvin said. "Again, you keep being—" She did not finish the sentence. "Thank you." After she hung up, Calvin lay in the dark for a while longer, not trying to sleep, just being there. The wind in the oak tree, the distant sound of the city doing what cities do at 1 in the morning. He thought about what Elijah sounded like through her voice. The way a person can be fully present in a room they are not in because someone who loves them is doing the talking. He thought about that for a while. Then he thought about something else. Something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the diner and had not moved from there no matter what else he thought about. He was the kind of man who stayed. He had known this about himself for a long time. It was not a virtue he was proud of in the way people are proud of things they chose. It was just true, the way other things were true, the color of his eyes, the way he could hear an engine knock from 50 feet away, the fact that he had never once in his life been able to walk past something broken and pretend he hadn't seen it. Gloria had said it was his best quality and his worst. You cannot save everything, Calvin. But he didn't stop trying. He had stayed with her through 3 miscarriages before Zara, stayed when his mother got sick, and his brother had been too far away and too busy, and Calvin had driven to Macon every weekend for 4 months and not said a word about it to either of them. Because it was not the kind of thing you said out loud, it was the kind of thing you just did. He had stayed in the shop when Darnell had his first heart scare, and the whole business almost went under. Stayed in the house that was too big for one person because leaving it felt like something he was not ready to call by its right name. He was the kind of man who stayed. The question, the one that kept him awake, in the silence of the bedroom at 1 in the morning in February, was not whether he was going to show up for Deja Lawson. He already knew the answer to that. The question was whether he understood what showing up was going to cost, and whether he was going to show up anyway. He was fairly sure he already knew the answer to that one too. 10 days later he called her, not to make plans, not to be anything, just to ask if he could come by. He said it the way he said most things, direct, without decoration. "I'd like to meet him, if that's okay with you. I've heard enough about him that it feels strange not to." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was working something out. "People come once," she said finally. "They get uncomfortable and they don't come back. I can't do that to him right now. I can't let people in and then have them disappear on him." "I understand that," Calvin said, "and I'm not going to tell you I'm different because everyone thinks they're different." A pause. "I'll just come, and then you can see." Another silence, longer. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said, "around 2. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building off Abernathy. Calvin took the stairs. He had brought nothing, no flowers, no food, nothing that would make the visit feel like a gesture rather than a fact. He knocked. Deja opened the door and looked at him with the same expression she'd had in the diner, that measuring look, quiet and careful. She stepped back to let him in. The living room had been remade. He had expected that, had heard enough in 2 hours of conversation to understand what it would look like. And still it required a moment of adjustment. The hospital bed where the couch should have been, the IV pole, the monitors on the side table with their quiet green numbers, the oxygen equipment in the corner, the whole careful architecture of keeping someone alive and comfortable in a space designed for neither. And in the middle of it, in the hospital bed, was Elijah. He was thin. Not just thin, the particular thinness that comes from a body that has been fighting something bigger than itself for too long and is starting to concede territory. His face had the carved quality of a face that used to carry more weight. His hair was close-cropped and going gray at the temples. He had an IV in his left arm and a pulse oximeter on his right index finger, and he was wearing an Atlanta Braves t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big for him now. His eyes were open and sharp. Calvin would remember that for a long time. How sharp Elijah's eyes were. Everything else in his face had gone quiet, the way things go quiet when the body is busy doing harder work, but his eyes were paying full attention. Calvin walked over to the side of the bed and pulled up the chair that was clearly there for exactly this purpose, and sat down so they were at the same level. "Elijah," he said, "I'm Calvin, I'm the mechanic." Elijah looked at him for a long moment, not unkindly, but the way someone looks when they are deciding something. "Sit down," Elijah said. His voice was quieter than Calvin had expected, but it was steady. "I want to know if you're real or if you're just being nice to my sister because you feel bad for her." From the kitchen doorway, Calvin heard Deja make a small sound. Calvin said, "I felt bad for her, at first. That part's honest." He kept his eyes on Elijah. "But you can't talk to someone for 2 hours about the people they love and feel bad for them afterward. After a while it becomes something else. What does it become?" Calvin thought about it. "Respect," he said. "And then something more than that. But I don't know her well enough yet to call it by the right name." Elijah held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, like something had been confirmed. "Tell me about the truck," he said. "The one that broke down on Valentine's Day." So Calvin told him about the truck, and Elijah asked questions, real questions, specific questions, the questions of someone who had spent time around mechanical things, or around people who had. They talked about the power steering issue and the rebuild Calvin had done 6 years ago, and the specific aggravation of a vehicle that you made with your own hands deciding to fail you in public. Elijah laughed once, a real laugh, short and genuine, at the detail about the shop parking lot, and the laugh cost him something. Calvin could see that, but he did not stop it or apologize for it. They talked for 3 hours. Deja moved in and out of the room, bringing water, adjusting Elijah's pillow, checking the monitor readouts, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to do this without making it look like surveillance. Twice she stood in the kitchen doorway long enough that Calvin knew she was listening without needing to be in the room. Near the end of the afternoon, Elijah grew quiet. His eyes had started to work a little harder to stay open. Calvin read it and stood up and said he should get going, and Elijah nodded and then said, with his eyes still mostly closed, "One more thing." Calvin stopped. "She's going to push you away when I'm gone." Elijah did not open his eyes. "She thinks that when I die, the reason anyone would stay disappears with me. She's been doing that math for 14 months. I need to know." A pause. "Long enough to be deliberate. Are you the kind of man who stays, or are you the kind who leaves clean?" The apartment was very quiet. The monitors hummed their small green hum. Outside a car went past on Abernathy. Calvin looked at the man in the bed, at the thinness of him, at the Braves t-shirt, at the hands that had played piano in the dark at 2 in the morning, until their mother came out in her robe not knowing whether to be angry or grateful. "I'm the kind who stays," Calvin said. Elijah was asleep before he finished the sentence, or close enough. Calvin let himself out. Deja walked him to the door and they stood in the hallway outside for a moment, and she looked at him and said nothing, and he said nothing. And then she said quietly, "Thank you for talking to him like that. He's easy to talk to." "He is," she said. "He always has been." She looked down at her hands. "He asked you if you were going to leave." "Yes, what did you say?" "I told him I stay." She nodded. Her jaw was working slightly, the way it does when you are holding a feeling in place through effort. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Just okay." He took the stairs back down, stood on the sidewalk outside the building on Abernathy, and looked up at the 3rd-floor window where the light was on. Stood there for a minute. Then he walked to his car. He drove home. And in the driveway he sat for a while in the dark before going inside, and thought about the question Elijah had asked. "Are you the kind of man who stays?" He had answered it out loud for the first time in 6 years. What surprised him was how easy the words had been. How they had come out without effort, without rehearsal. Like they had been sitting right there the whole time, just waiting for the right person to ask. He went inside, made coffee, stood at the kitchen counter in the quiet of his house, and thought about Elijah's eyes, sharp and tired and still paying full attention. He thought about Deja's voice in the dark at 1 in the morning. He thought about what kind of man he was. He already knew. He had always known. The question was whether knowing it was enough, whether staying, in this particular situation, in this particular season, at this particular cost, whether that was something he could do not because it was easy, but because it was true. He stood in his kitchen for a long time. Then he washed his cup and went to bed. The thing about building something in the middle of a storm is that you never quite know what you're building until the storm stops. Calvin did not think of it in those terms at the time. At the time, he was just showing up. That was all. Just showing up the way he showed up to the shop every morning. Not because it was easy. Not because the day always went the way he planned. But because the alternative was not showing up, and that was not something he knew how to do. He came by the apartment on Abernathy 3 evenings a week. Sometimes 4. Not always at the same time, because his schedule did not work that way. Shop hours ran long when they ran long, and short jobs became complicated, and a transmission rebuild that should have taken 6 hours could stretch into 9 without warning. But he came. He texted when he was on his way. He brought nothing except himself, which after some thought he decided was the right call. No flowers, no food in containers that implied he was trying to make an impression. Just himself. In his work clothes most of the time. Grease under his fingernails that he had started to stop apologizing for. Elijah called him the mechanic for the first 2 weeks, not unkindly. Just the way Elijah named things with a precision that was also somehow affectionate. Deja called it his tell. She said Elijah only gave people nicknames when he'd decided they were allowed to stay. The evenings had a shape. Calvin would arrive, and Deja would be in the middle of something: dinner, medications, the careful management of 100 small tasks that made up the work of keeping another person comfortable. He would sit with Elijah. Talk, or not talk. Elijah had good hours and hard hours, and Calvin learned to read the difference inside of 30 seconds from the doorway, before he even crossed the room. Good hours meant conversation, jazz, Elijah's opinions about things, which were numerous and specific and often hilarious. Hard hours meant silence, meant Calvin pulling the chair close and sitting there and doing exactly what he had done on the phone that first night, being present without requiring anything from the presence. He learned that Elijah's favorite recording of all time was Bill Evans' Waltz for Debbie, live at the Village Vanguard, 1961, not the studio version, the live one, with the room noise in it, the glasses and the conversation in the background. He learned this because Elijah told him once, and then Calvin came back the next week and said he had listened to it, and Elijah had looked at him with an expression that was suspicious of being moved. "What did you think?" Elijah said. "I think I didn't know what I was missing," Calvin said. "And I think that's a specific kind of loss." Elijah looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He came, he stayed. He left when Elijah needed to rest and Deja needed to manage the next part of the evening alone. He did not ask for anything in return. He did not frame it as sacrifice. It was just the shape of the days now, and he had accepted the shape. What he had not fully accounted for was Zara. She came home in mid-March, spring break. 1 bag, a portfolio case, and the particular energy of a 22-year-old who had been waiting to say something for several weeks and had been patient about it long enough. She met Deja on a Thursday evening. They were at Calvin's kitchen table, the 3 of them, eating the baked chicken Zara had insisted on making, and which was very good because Zara had her mother's instincts in a kitchen and her father's stubbornness about following through. The conversation was easy. Deja was easy to talk to when she was not exhausted, and Zara was easy to talk to always. They talked about Savannah, about Zara's thesis project, about the ER and the things Deja had seen that she could and couldn't talk about. Calvin sat between them and ate his chicken and felt, for the first time in longer than he could immediately calculate, like the table was full in the way a table was supposed to be full. It was good. For 2 hours it was genuinely good. Then Deja went home to relieve Beverly and Zara did the dishes and Calvin wiped down the counter and his daughter said, without turning around from the sink, "How long have you been sleeping 4 hours a night?" Not a question. "Not really." Calvin said, "I sleep fine, Dad, I do." Zara turned around, dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at him with Gloria's eyes. That was the thing about Zara, she had her mother's face in certain expressions and this was one of them. The one that meant she had already done the math and she was waiting for him to catch up. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "The thing, after Mom died, where you took care of everything and everyone, and didn't let anyone ask how you were doing. Because if they asked you would have to answer." She folded the dish towel, set it down. "You're pouring everything into her situation so you don't have to feel your own." Calvin said, "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He opened his mouth, closed it. Zara said, "I like her, Dad. I really do. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm saying make sure you know why you're doing it. Because there's a difference between choosing someone and using someone as a reason to not deal with your own stuff." A pause. "And I need to know which one this is. Because she deserves to know too." Calvin stood in his kitchen with the dish towel his daughter had just folded sitting on the counter between them and felt the specific discomfort of being known too well by someone you love too much to lie to. He said, "I'm choosing her." Zara looked at him. "I know the difference," he said. "I know what using someone looks like, and this isn't it." "Okay," she said. Not convinced, not unconvinced, just watching. "Okay?" I said, "Okay, Dad. I'm not fighting you on it." She picked up her glass of water. "I'm just saying, know why you're staying. Not for her, for you. Know it in your own chest, Dust. So that when things get harder, and they are going to get harder, or not standing there it's tight, trying to figure out the answer under pressure." She went to bed. Calvin stood in the kitchen for a while longer. He was still thinking about it when he finally turned off the lights. The insurance denial came on a Tuesday. Deja called him from the parking lot of the pharmacy. He could tell she was in a parking lot from the acoustic, the flat, open sound, and the distant ambient noise of a shopping center. He could tell she had been crying recently from the careful steadiness of her voice. When Deja was crying or had been crying, her voice went very even, very controlled. The nurse voice, the one that didn't waver because she had trained it not to waver so it wouldn't scare patients. She was using the nurse voice. "The medication Beverly recommended," she said. "The pain management protocol. The insurance company denied it. They're calling it experimental." A pause. "It's not experimental. It's been approved. It's just newer, and it's more effective, and it costs more, and so, apparently my brother's comfort in the last months of his life is not medically necessary," Calvin said. "How much?" "Calvin, how much out of pocket?" Silence. "Deja, $1,200 a week," she said. "And I've been covering it. I've been covering it from savings, but I'm 4 weeks in and I don't know how much longer I can." She stopped. "I don't need you to fix it. I just needed to tell someone." "Okay," he said. "I hear you," he heard her. And then he hung up the phone and sat in his truck in the shop parking lot for 3 minutes and did the math in his head. His truck, which was now running again because he had fixed it himself over a weekend using parts he'd gotten at cost through the shop supplier. The math was not complicated. $1,200 a week. His take-home after taxes was better than it used to be, but it was not $1,200 a week better. He went inside and found Darnell in the office. Coach Darnell ran the shop the way he had coached high school football for 12 years before his knees went, which was to say, loudly, fairly, and with an absolute refusal to let anyone half commit to anything. He was 55 and built like someone who had once been considerably larger and was now just large. He had known Calvin for 8 years. He knew, without Calvin ever having said it directly, that something had shifted in Calvin's life over the past several weeks. He had not asked because Darnell operated on the principle that people told you what you needed to know when they were ready to tell it. Calvin sat down in the chair across from the desk and said, "I need more hours." Darnell looked at him over his reading glasses. "Night work, weekends, whatever you've got." "We've got it," Darnell said. "You want to tell me why?" Calvin told him. "Not everything, enough." Elijah. The insurance denial. The medication. Deja working nights and caring for him days, and now watching her savings run down toward a line she didn't say out loud but that Calvin could hear clearly. Darnell listened. He did not interrupt. When Calvin was done, Darnell took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk and said, "How much are we talking?" $1,200 a week. Darnell nodded slowly. "You can't cover that on extra shifts." "I can cover some of it, Calvin. Some is better than none." Darnell looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his glasses back on and looked back at the papers on his desk. "You're on night starting Wednesday," he said. 8 to close. Calvin said, "Thank you." Darnell said, "Don't thank me. Just go home and sleep before Wednesday because you look terrible." He did not tell Deja. That was his calculation, and he had made it deliberately. She had said she didn't need him to fix it. She had said she just needed to tell someone, and he had heard that. And he understood it. And he also understood that there was a difference between respecting what someone said they needed and standing still when there was something you could actually do. He started the night shifts Wednesday. 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when the weekend overflow came in. He was coming home at midnight 30, 1 in the morning. Sleeping 4 hours, up at 6, shop again by 7. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. His hands stopped being sore because they were past sore into a kind of permanent state that he had stopped registering. He paid the pharmacy directly. He did not tell her how. He thought he had 3 more weeks before she figured it out. He had one. She called on a Thursday morning before he had finished his first cup of coffee. Not the nurse voice this time. The other one. The one that was lower and faster and meant she had been awake and working something out. "Beverly told me," she said. "The pharmacy account. The payments." Calvin set his coffee down. "I told you not to fix it. I know. I told you I didn't need. I know what you told me. Then why? Her voice caught, steadied itself. Calvin, you cannot afford this. You are working night shifts. I called the shop and Darnell's assistant picked up at 11:30 at night, and you were still there. You cannot let me ask you something, he said. She stopped. If I needed something, if I needed a thing and you could give it to me, would you? Silence. Would you? He said again. That's not the same, she said. This is too much. Too much for what? For what we are. We've known each other 6 weeks, Calvin. You're working night shifts for someone you've known for 6 weeks. I'm not doing it for someone I've known for 6 weeks, he said. I'm doing it for you. There's a difference. She did not have an answer for that. He could hear her not having it. You told me you didn't need me to fix it, he said. And you were right. I can't fix it. I know I can't. But I can do this one thing. And I'm going to keep doing it, and I need you to let me, because it is the one thing I can actually do, and I need somewhere to put that. A long silence. Very long. Then quietly, you have to let me pay you back. You don't have to do anything, Calvin said. Just another silence. Shorter. Okay, she said. The word came out rough around the edges. Like it had cost her something to say it. He picked his coffee back up. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. What Calvin did not know, could not have known, was what was happening at the same time across the city. Darnell had not gone home after their conversation. He had sat in his office for 20 more minutes after Calvin left, doing his own math. Then he had made 3 phone calls, the first to his wife, the second to the pastor at Mount Zion, where he had attended for 22 years, the third to a man named Porter, who ran the neighborhood association 2 blocks from the shop, and who had a talent for organizing things quickly when things needed organizing. By Sunday there was a table in the fellowship hall at Mount Zion after the 11 o'clock service. Darnell had not asked Calvin's permission. He had not asked Calvin anything. He had just told people what was happening plainly, without dramatizing it, and then stepped back. The shop put in the first envelope. 12 mechanics, each putting in what they could. Then the congregation. Then the neighborhood association. Then a few business owners on Auburn Avenue who knew Darnell and trusted his judgment. 3 weeks later, Darnell came to Deja's apartment on a Wednesday evening with an envelope. Calvin was there. He had not known Darnell was coming. Darnell knocked, and Deja opened the door, and he introduced himself and handed her the envelope and said, "This is from the congregation at Mount Zion and some folks from the neighborhood. Calvin didn't ask us to do this. He didn't ask us for anything. We just found out what was happening and decided to help." A pause. $6,000. Should cover several weeks at least. Deja looked at the envelope. She looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at Darnell. Darnell said, "Don't make a big thing of it," and turned and took the stairs back down. Deja stood in the doorway holding the envelope. She was wearing scrubs from her night shift, and her hair was back, and she had been awake for 19 hours. And she looked, in that moment, like someone whose structural supports had just been reinforced from a direction she had not been watching. She sat down on the floor right there in the doorway. Not because her legs gave out, just because sitting down was the only response her body had available. Calvin sat down next to her, on the floor of the hallway, in his work clothes. She put her face in her hands and her shoulders shook, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and he held on, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then she said, into her hands, "I don't know how to be a person who gets helped." "I know," he said. "I've been the one doing the helping for so long. I don't know what this is." "I know," he said again. "Calvin." "Yeah, thank you." She lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were red, not for the money, for being the kind of man who makes other people want to show up. He didn't have an answer for that. So he just stayed where he was on the floor of the hallway and held on. April arrived and Elijah began to sleep more. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way these things happen. First it was 2 extra hours in the afternoon, then 3. Then the good hours shortened from 2 hours to 90 minutes to sometimes 45, where he was present and sharp, and then suddenly he wasn't, and his eyes would close with a completeness that meant the conversation was over. Calvin adjusted. He learned to make the time count differently. Less talking, more listening. He would sit with Elijah in the afternoons during the good hours, and sometimes Elijah would talk, and sometimes he would just have the music on Bill Evans or Coltrane. Or sometimes something Calvin didn't recognize that Elijah would identify without opening his eyes. Name and year and album, and the story behind why it mattered, and Calvin would sit there and absorb it. One afternoon, in the middle of a 20-minute window, when Elijah was clear and awake and himself, Elijah looked at Calvin and said, "You write anything down?" Calvin said, "What do you mean? Things you want to say, that you haven't figured out how to say?" A breath. I started keeping a notebook when I got the diagnosis. I didn't know why at first. But you write things down and they get real in a different way. They stop being noise. Calvin thought about the notebook on his bedside table that he had owned for 4 years and never opened. I've got one, he said. Never used it. Start, Elijah said. Not a suggestion. Just said it the way Elijah said things that were settled. Calvin started writing that night. Not well, not coherently. Just whatever was in his head when he sat down, which turned out to be more than he had expected. He wrote about Gloria and about the kitchen at 2 a.m. and about Zara's school plays. He wrote about the night in the diner, about Elijah's eyes, about the specific quality of Deja's voice when she talked about her brother, the way it was always doing 2 things at once, holding it together and breaking apart, simultaneously, every single time. He filled 6 pages the first night. He didn't show it to anyone. He wasn't sure it was for showing, it was just for knowing, for making things real in a different way, the way Elijah had said. Zara came home again in late April. She had a week between a studio review and her final exams, and she spent it partly in Savannah catching up on sleep, and partly in Atlanta because she could read her father's energy from 200 miles away, and the reading was not great. She came to the apartment on Abernathy with Calvin one afternoon. She had met Elijah once before, briefly, in early March, and she had been quiet afterward in a way that told Calvin she had been moved, and was processing it in her own time. Now she came in and sat down and talked to Elijah for an hour, about music she knew enough from growing up in Calvin's house, where music was always running in the background, to ask the right questions, and Elijah lit up the way he lit up, when someone was genuinely curious, rather than just polite about it. After Elijah fell asleep, Zara helped Deja in the kitchen, and Calvin watched his daughter move through that space, careful, useful, not in the way, and felt something complicated and large that he did not immediately have a name for. Later, on the drive back to Calvin's house, Zara said, "He's not going to make it to summer." "No," Calvin said. "He's not." A long pause, the highway at dusk, the orange light going orange to pink to gray. "Are you ready for that?" Zara said. "No," he said. "Is she?" "No." Zara looked out the window. "Okay," she said. "Then you just have to be there when it happens, that's all. You can't fix it, and you can't prepare for it. You just have to be there." He looked at his daughter, 22 years old, telling him things he should have been telling her. "When did you get so smart?" he said. "I've always been this smart," Zara said. "You just weren't ready to hear it." They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was full of things neither of them needed to say out loud. The good kind of silence. The kind that meant you were with someone who already knew. The call came on a Friday morning in early May. Not a real call, no words when he answered, just breathing. He knew immediately. The breathing told him everything. He said, "I'm on my way." He was there in 19 minutes. He might have run a light, he was not certain. Beverly was in the hallway outside the apartment with her bag, coat on, keys in hand. She looked at Calvin when he came off the stairs and said, simply, 20 minutes ago. "She's inside with him." He went in. The apartment was quiet. Not the quiet of sleeping or the quiet of waiting. A different quiet. The kind that settles into a room and stays. Deja was sitting on the floor next to the hospital bed with her back against the side of it, and her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them. She was looking at nothing. Her face was not doing anything in particular. She was past the kind of crying that looks like crying and into the kind that lives deeper and doesn't show except in the stillness of the person. Elijah's face was peaceful. That was the only word for it. The hardness of effort was gone. What was left was just his face, without the work of being sick in it, and he looked like someone who had put down something very heavy and was finally resting. Calvin did not say anything. He did not say, "I'm so sorry." He did not say he's at peace or he's not suffering or any of the true things that are also not enough. He walked to the side of the room, sat down on the floor next to Deja, his back against the hospital bed the same way hers was, his legs out in front of him the same way hers weren't quite, and he stayed there. 2 hours. He did not know it was 2 hours until later. At the time it was just time, just being there in it. The monitors had been turned off by Beverly before she left, so the room was just the room, the light from the window, going from morning light to midday light, the sounds from outside, cars and someone's music and the ordinary sounds of a city going about its ordinary day, which seemed wrong and also exactly right. At some point Deja's head came down onto his shoulder. He did not move. "At some point after that," she said, quietly, "he told me you were real." Calvin did not answer right away. "When did he tell you that?" "Last week. One of his good mornings." He said. She stopped, cleared her throat. He said, "The real ones don't talk about staying, they just do it. And then he told me to stop waiting for you to leave." Calvin looked at the light from the window. He was right, he said. Deja made a sound that was not quite a word. They stayed on the floor until her legs started to go numb, and she needed to move. And he helped her up, and they stood in the quiet room together, and then there were calls to make and people to notify, and the machinery of loss that always kicks in after the loss itself, practical and relentless. And Calvin helped with all of it. He stayed until 9 that night. Came back the next morning. Helped with the calls, the arrangements, the small and enormous administrative reality of someone being gone. He came back every day for the next 2 weeks. Then one evening in late June he came by and Deja was quieter than usual. Not the grief quiet which he knew well by now. Something else. A different quality to the silence. She was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she did not quite meet his eyes when he came in, and he felt it before she said anything. The way you feel a change in the air before the weather shifts. He sat down across from her. She said, "I've been thinking." He waited. About what happens now. He waited. You came into our lives because of Elijah, because he was sick, because she stopped. Because the situation required someone to show up, and you are someone who shows up for situations. She looked at her tea, and Elijah's gone now. The situation is over, and I keep thinking about what's left when you remove the situation. Me, Calvin said, and you. But who are we without it, she said. That's what I can't figure out who I am without being his caregiver. I can't figure out who I am without the crisis. And I don't know if you know who you are without someone to help. She finally looked at him. What happens when I'm not in crisis anymore? What happens when I'm just a regular person having regular days? Is that enough? For you? Is that what you stayed for? Calvin opened his mouth. She shook her head. I don't want you to answer right now. I need some time to figure out who I am in a life without him. And I can't do that here. I can't do it while you're here being you, because it's easier to just lean on you, and I don't know how to tell the difference between needing you and leaning on you because it's easier than standing alone, he said. Those aren't the same thing. I know, she said. I know. But I can't tell which one it is right now, and I have to be able to tell. He sat with that. He understood it. He did not like it. But he understood it in the way he understood hard mechanical things. Not everything that breaks can be fixed by adding something. Sometimes you have to remove the pressure first to see what the actual problem is, he said. How long? I don't know. Okay. Calvin, I'm not going anywhere, he said. Take the time, figure it out, I'll be here. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was too complicated to name. Gratitude and grief and guilt and something else. Something that looked a lot like love but was trying very hard to not say so. I'm sorry, she said. Don't apologize, he said. Just come back. He drove home. He did not call. He did not text. He sat on it the way you sit on a hard thing when you have decided to sit on it and not reach for it every 5 minutes. He went to work. He came home. He ate. He slept when sleep came. He opened the notebook on his bedside table and he wrote. He wrote a lot about Elijah, about the floor of the apartment, about the 2 hours of silence that had been the most real 2 hours of his recent life, about what it felt like to know someone was gone and to stay in the room with the knowing rather than leaving before it got too heavy. He wrote about Deja. Not everything, just the things he couldn't say. 3 weeks passed, then a month, then 6 weeks, and Zara came home again in late July and found her father making coffee at 6 in the morning, looking like someone who had been underwater for a while and was technically breathing, but not quite surfaced. She sat down at the kitchen table. She hasn't called, he said. Not a question. I know. I'm not going to call first, I know. Zara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with that Gloria look again, the one that had done the math already. Dad, she said. Can I ask you something? Sure. Is this the space thing or the disappearing thing? He looked at her. Because there's a difference, Zara said, between giving someone space to breathe and letting someone disappear, because it's easier than asking them to stay. She folded her hands on the table. You told her you'd be here, but does she know you're actually here? Or does she think you've moved on because you haven't called? Calvin stood at the counter with his coffee. He thought about that. Zara said, You write things down, right? You've been writing things in that notebook. I've seen the light on at 2 in the morning. She looked at him steadily. Write her something. Not to push, not to pressure. Just so she knows you haven't gone anywhere. Because staying doesn't count if she doesn't know you're doing it. He looked at his daughter. She picked up her orange juice. I've always been this smart, she said. You're just always slow to catch up. He sat down at the table, and this time he did not have an argument. The spare bedroom at Kezia's apartment was 11 feet by 9 feet. Deja knew this because she had measured it, not with a tape measure, with steps, 11 one way, 9 the other. She had walked it enough times in the dark. that she knew exactly where the floorboard creaked near the closet, and exactly how many steps from the bed to the window, and exactly what the street looked like at 3 in the morning, when sleep had stopped being a thing that happened and had become instead a thing other people did. She had been at Kezia's for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in an 11 by 9 room with a window that faced east and woke her up every morning at 6:15 whether she wanted to be awake or not, which she didn't. Because being awake meant being in the day, and being in the day meant being in a life that no longer had its organizing principle. For 14 months her days had been structured around Elijah, his medications, his appointments, his good hours and hard hours, the rhythm of caring for someone that becomes so complete you forget there was ever a rhythm before it. And now there was no rhythm. Just the room and the east-facing window and the days arriving whether she asked for them or not. Kezia was patient. Kezia was, in fact, the most patient person Deja had ever known, which was saying something given that Kezia also had opinions about everything, and was not quiet about having them. She brought Deja coffee every morning and did not make her talk about anything she didn't want to talk about, and watched her friend move through the apartment, like a woman trying to remember how to occupy space, and said nothing except, occasionally, "I love you," which was exactly the right thing, and Kezia knew it. What Kezia said, 6 weeks in, on a Tuesday morning was, "I made you an appointment." Deja looked up from her coffee. Dr. Simone Obi is in grief, caregiver burnout, loss. Kezia sat down across from her. "She has an opening Thursday at 2. Deja said, "I don't need. You haven't slept more than 4 hours at a time since May," Kezia said. "You've lost 12 pounds. You left the man who showed up for you and your brother every single day for 3 months. Because you convinced yourself you weren't worth staying for." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You need Thursday at 2. Deja looked at her coffee. "Okay," she said. Dr. Simone Obi had an office on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree, with a window that looked out over the city and plants on the windowsill that were actually alive, which Deja noticed and filed away as a good sign. The office was warm, not performed warm. Actually warm, the kind of room that had been tended by someone who thought carefully about how spaces felt to people arriving in pain. Dr. Obi was in her late 40s, natural hair, close-cropped, glasses with tortoise-shell frames. She had the quality of someone who had heard a great many hard things and had not been made smaller by any of them. She sat across from Deja with a notepad she barely looked at and said, after the first 10 minutes of mapping the shape of what had happened, "Tell me about the day you left." Deja told her. The packing. Calvin standing in the kitchen. The things she had said. "You told him he only stayed because of Elijah," Dr. Obi said. "Yes. Do you believe that?" A long pause. "I believed it that day," Deja said. "What's changed?" "Nothing's changed, that's the problem. Nothing changed and I'm still sitting with the same question. Which is?" Deja looked at the plants on the windowsill. "Who am I when there's no one to take care of? Because I've been someone's caregiver since I was 19 years old. My mother got sick first, then she passed, then Elijah. And being needed, that was the thing that made me make sense to myself. And now I'm not needed by anyone and I don't." She stopped. "I don't know what I am without that," Dr. Obi said, and Calvin. "What does he represent in that question?" "He represents the possibility that I'm worth something when I'm not being useful." She said it quietly. "And that's the scariest thing I've ever tried to believe." "Why is it scary?" "Because if I believe it and I'm wrong." She did not finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They met every Thursday after that. Sometimes twice a week when the weeks were hard. And the weeks were often hard because grief does not follow a schedule and does not care that you have processed the first layer and would like to move on to the next. It comes back. At the pharmacy when you reach for a medication you no longer need to buy. At the grocery store in the cereal aisle next to a brand Elijah had liked. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when a jazz melody comes through the wall from a neighbor's apartment and your body recognizes it before your mind does. And you are sitting on the floor of the hallway before you understand why. Deja went to the floor a lot in those months, and she got back up every time. That was the thing she was learning, slowly. The way you learn a language you never formally studied, not how to stop falling, but how to get up again, and what it felt like to stand. And how standing was not the same as being fine, but it was enough. It was enough to keep going. What she did not tell Dr. Obi, for the first 2 months, was that she thought about Calvin every day. Not in the dramatic way, not in the way of songs and longing and the sharp pain of absence, in the ordinary way, which was somehow worse. She would be doing something completely unremarkable, making tea, folding laundry, standing at the sink, and she would think about him. About the way he had listened to her talk about Elijah for 2 hours the night they met, and never once said, "I'm sorry," not once, had just asked her to keep going. About the way he had looked at her across a table, and said nothing in particular, and communicated everything necessary at the same time. About the way he said, "I'll be here" when she left. Not "call me when you're ready," not "I'll give you space," just "I'll be here." She had not called. She told herself it was because she needed the time, and she did need the time. She told herself it was because she wasn't ready, and she wasn't ready. But there was a third reason she didn't say out loud, not even to Dr. Obi for the first 2 months, which was this. She was afraid that if she called and he had moved on, if the weeks had done what weeks sometimes do and let a person settle into the new shape of their days, without you she would not have the structural integrity to survive it. So she didn't call. She measured the 11 by 9 room instead. October came. Her birthday was the 14th. 37 years old. She woke up at 6:15 as always, the east-facing window doing its reliable work, and lay in the dark, thinking about Elijah the way she thought about him every morning, with a tenderness that had started to lose its sharpest edges, which Dr. Obi had told her was not forgetting and was not betrayal but was just what time did, carefully, to the parts that would otherwise cut you open every single time. Kezia made her French toast for breakfast. They sat at the kitchen table, and Kezia did not make a production of the birthday, because Dija had asked her not to. They just ate breakfast. That was enough. At 11 o'clock there was a knock at the door. Kezia answered it. Deja heard voices in the hallway, Kezia's and a man's she didn't immediately place. Then Kezia came to the kitchen doorway with an expression that was working very hard at neutral. "There's someone here for you," she said. A man named Theo Barnes. Deja set her coffee down. She knew the name, Theo Barnes. Elijah's oldest friend, the bass player who had been on every recording Elijah ever made, who Elijah had mentioned in some of his clearest hours near the end. "Theo and I used to play a Tuesday residency on Auburn Avenue, back when Tuesday residencies were still a thing, and who had shown up at the memorial service and stood in the back and said afterward, simply, 'I'm bad at funerals, but I wasn't going to miss it.'" She went to the door. Theo was tall and lean, early 60s, with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent his life listening for the note underneath the note. He was holding a plain white envelope. He held it out and said, "He gave me this in January, 4 months before he passed." A pause. "He said give it to you on your birthday, not before. He was very specific about that." Deja took the envelope. Theo said, "I'll leave you with it," and turned and went down the stairs without another word. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down and held the envelope for a moment before she opened it. Elijah's handwriting. She knew at the instant she saw the outside of the envelope, the slant of the letters, the way they leaned slightly right as if they were always in a hurry to get somewhere. He had written it himself, which meant January, which meant his hands had still been mostly steady, which meant he had planned this for a long time. She opened it and unfolded the pages. He wrote about their mother, about the apartment on Northside Drive, where they grew up, and the way their mother sang while she cooked, even when she had nothing to sing about. He wrote about the road trip, when Deja was 24, just the two of them, Atlanta to Chicago in his old Buick, with no working air conditioning, and the way Deja had complained about the heat the entire drive through Tennessee, and then, when they crossed the state line, just started laughing. He had never been able to fully explain why that moment was one of his favorite memories. He wrote it down here anyway. He wrote about the diagnosis, about what it was like to hear the word terminal, and then watch his little sister, who he had always been the one to look after, always the one keeping an eye on, shift into the most capable person he had ever seen, without being asked and without complaint, about how she had moved into his apartment and rebuilt her entire daily life around his care, and given 14 months of herself without once, not once, making him feel like a burden. He wrote, "I spent a lot of those 14 months watching you be strong. I want you to know I also saw you being tired. I saw both, and I need you to know that the tired parts were just as brave as the strong parts. Maybe braver." She had to stop reading. She put the pages on the table and looked at the window and the October morning beyond it, and sat there until she could see well enough to keep going. He wrote about Calvin. Not at length. Elijah had never been the kind of person who used more words than the job required. But he wrote about the afternoon Calvin came and sat with him for 3 hours, talking about engines and Bill Evans, like they had known each other for years. He wrote about what he had seen when he watched them together, not the words they exchanged, but the quality underneath the words. Two people in a room who were already at ease in each other before they had any reason to be. He wrote. I asked him straight out if he was staying, or if he was just being decent to a woman in a hard situation. He answered before I finished the sentence. Not because he was trying to say the right thing. I know the difference between someone performing an answer and someone who simply knows something. Calvin knows something, he knows it about you. Then he wrote you left him, and I understand why. And now stop. She almost laughed. That was so Elijah, the precision of it. The way he could say the hardest thing and make it land clean. He wrote, you've been taking care of people since you were 19 years old. You've been useful your whole life. And somewhere along the way you confused being useful with being worth something. They are not the same thing, Deja. You were worth something the moment you showed up. You don't have to earn it every single day. He wrote, Calvin is not staying because you need saving. He's staying because he chose you. There is a difference, a real one. Let yourself know the difference. He wrote, be happy, not for me. You've spent enough of your life doing things for other people. Be happy for you. You've earned it in ways I don't have enough pages to count. And Deja, go home, wherever that is now. Go find it and go there. The letter ended, I love you more than every recording I ever made, and some of those recordings were genuinely excellent, so you understand the weight of what I'm saying. She sat at Kezia's kitchen table with the pages in her hands. The October morning went from early light to full morning outside the window. Kezia came in at some point and poured more coffee into her cup without speaking and went back out, which was exactly right. Deja sat there and thought about everything Elijah had said. Not just the parts about Calvin, all of it. The tired parts were just as brave as the strong parts. You confused being useful with being worth something. She thought about Dr. Obi asking her what scared her about believing she was worth something when she wasn't being useful. She thought about the answer she had never finished. Because if I believe it, and I'm wrong, but what if she wasn't wrong? What if the man who had sat on the floor of her brother's room and stayed without being asked had done that not out of pity, but simply because that was who he was? What if it was that plain and that enormous simultaneously? What if some people were built a certain way, the staying kind, the showing up kind, the kind that did not leave when things became hard, because leaving was simply not in the architecture of them? And she had spent 3 months in an 11-by-9 room, being afraid of something that was actually just true. She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, looked at Kezia in the doorway. I need to borrow your car, she said. Kezia reached into her pocket and held out the keys without a single word. Deja drove across Atlanta. She had not been to Calvin's neighborhood since July. The streets were the same. The oak trees on his block had gone orange and gold the way Atlanta oaks do in October all at once, as if they had decided together. And the afternoon light was low and warm, and the whole street looked like a photograph someone was going to look at later and say that was a real day, that actually happened, and mean it. She parked in front of the house, sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. She was wearing the burgundy wrap dress she'd had for years, the one that moved when she moved, and her hair was down silk press, the way she wore it when she wasn't going anywhere in particular. And the day turned out to matter. She had not planned that. It was just the day. But standing on the sidewalk in the October light, she was glad for it. Not for him, for herself. Because Elijah was right about this too, she was worth the effort of showing up as herself. Fully. Without apology, she knocked, heard footsteps inside, unhurried, even. The footsteps of a man not expecting anything. The door opened and there he was, jeans and the gray thermal he wore under his coveralls when the temperature dropped, grease under his fingernails from whatever the afternoon had brought. His face when he saw her moved through several things quickly: surprise, something immediate and unguarded he didn't have time to cover, and then the steadiness that was simply how he was built. He didn't say anything, she said. I got a letter today. He waited, from Elijah. He left it with Theo, for my birthday. She looked at him. He told me to stop running. Calvin said, you want to come in? I need to say something first. He leaned against the doorframe. Listening, I was wrong, she said, about why you stayed. I built a story that made sense given everything I believed about myself at the time. And I held on to that story instead of looking at what was actually in front of me. She took a breath. You came to that apartment and you sat with my brother. And you worked night shifts without telling me, and you let an entire community show up because of the kind of man you are. And I left because I was scared that once there was no crisis left, you'd look around and realize there was nothing worth staying for. A pause. Elijah told me that's not what happened, and I think I already knew that when I left. I just wasn't ready to trust it. Calvin was looking at her, not moving, not filling the space with anything. I'm asking, she said, if it's too late. He straightened up from the doorframe and opened the door wider. She walked in. The house smelled the same. Coffee and the faint trace of motor oil, and underneath both of those something warm and settled. That was just the smell of a place lived in for years by someone who didn't leave. The kitchen. The table. The counter where she had stood the first time she came here and watched him making coffee with the focused attention he brought to things he did with his hands. Footsteps on the stairs. Zara came around the corner and stopped. She looked at Deja, looked at her father, looked at Deja again. And Zara Reed, 22 years old, sharp as her father and considerably warmer about showing it, said, "I'm going to make coffee," and walked back to the kitchen without another word. And that was that. They talked until late. Not about everything and not all at once. Some things needed more time to be said carefully, and this was not the night to rush them. They talked about Elijah, about what the letter had said and what it felt like to receive a message from someone already gone. About the 3 months. Calvin told her what he had done during them plainly and without framing it as endurance, the notebook he had started on Elijah's instruction. 6 pages the first night, more after that. The words he had written that weren't for showing to anyone, just for making things real in a different way. Deja said, Calvin said, mostly you, and Elijah, and what I understood about myself after May. She was quiet. I wrote about what it felt like to be the right thing in a room, he said. To not be able to fix anything or change anything, and to still know that being there was enough, that it was what was needed. He paused. I hadn't felt that way in a long time before that. Since Gloria, she said. Since Gloria. She stayed until Zara fell asleep on the couch, which happened sometime around 11, with her long legs hanging off the armrest, and her phone on her chest, and her face doing the thing faces do when they've finally stood down from being watchful. Deja looked at her, then at Calvin. She was rooting for me to come back, Deja said. She was telling me to go get you, Calvin said. I kept saying I was giving you space. There's a difference between giving someone space and letting them disappear. Calvin looked at her. She said that, Deja said. Didn't she? Close enough, he said. She looked at Zara asleep on the couch, at the way his daughter had walked in, seen the situation for what it was, and started making coffee without requiring a single explanation. She's something else, Deja said. I know, Calvin said. Her mother would have liked you. That landed quietly. The way true things land when they're not trying to be anything other than true. They sat with it. The next 3 months were a different kind of building. Not the building they had done before, which had happened inside the structure of Elijah's illness, and taken its shape from that. This was building without a frame. Just the two of them, and the ordinary days, and the question of what they were to each other when the extraordinary circumstances had been set aside. The answer turned out to be this, just this. Coffee in the morning when Deja stayed, and Calvin made it exactly right, without asking because he paid attention. Sunday dinners at Calvin's house with Zara when she came home from Savannah, which she did more often now, and which always ran long because both Lawson women talked, and both Reed people listened, and the combination made for evenings that didn't want to end. Deja sitting in the shop parking lot at lunchtime, on days she was on that side of the city, eating sandwiches on the hood of Calvin's truck, while he told her about whatever the complicated job of the week was, and her telling him about the families she was starting to work with, because she had started working again. Not at Grady. She had gone back to the ER for 3 weeks and understood quickly that she couldn't be there the way she needed to be, not yet, maybe not in that capacity again, but she had found something that fit differently. A non-profit on the west side that worked with families navigating end-of-life care, helping people understand their options, sitting with families in the conversations nobody wanted to have, and helping them have them anyway. She brought to it everything she knew, the nursing knowledge, the caregiver knowledge, and the knowledge that only comes from having sat in a room and stayed through the hardest part of it. She thought of it as doing what Elijah did, making rooms warmer just by being in them. January came in cold and gray. Calvin told her one Friday evening that he wanted to take her somewhere. She looked at him. Tomorrow, he said. Dress warm. She didn't ask where. She had learned by now that Calvin didn't describe things in advance. He just did them. And the doing was always more than the description would have been. He drove them across the city on a Saturday afternoon, the January light flat and silver over Atlanta. She didn't recognize the neighborhood at first. Then she did. 2 blocks from Abernathy. The street she had not been back to since the fall. He parked and got out, and she got out, and they were standing on a corner she knew. The Marigold Diner was gone. The windows were papered over from the inside, and there was a permit notice on the door, and the sign had been taken down. leaving a lighter rectangle on the brick face where it had been for decades. Calvin had mentioned it once in passing in November. Drove by Marigold last week. Looks like they finally closed for good, and she had filed it away without knowing why. Now she knew why. He stood on the sidewalk in front of where the door had been. He turned to her. The January wind came from the south, which in Atlanta means it comes cold and at an angle you weren't prepared for. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His face had the quality it had when he had decided something and was going to say it without decoration. He went down on one knee on the brick sidewalk. He reached into his jacket pocket. The ring was a silver band with one small diamond set low. Practical in the way Calvin was practical. She knew without being told that he had chosen it himself, thought about it. Chosen it carefully because it was right and not because it was impressive. "I've been trying to write a speech since November," he said. "Nothing came out sounding like me, so I'm going to say what's true instead." He looked up at her. "This is where it started. You walked in and sat down, and your whole life was in your hands that night. All of it, the real parts, the hard parts, and a man who didn't deserve you walked out because of it. I walked across the room." He paused. "I have never once in the months since wished I'd stayed at the counter. Every version of my life I want has you in it. That's the whole thing. Will you marry me?" Deja stood on the sidewalk in front of the papered-over windows of Marigold Diner with the cold January wind coming from the wrong direction and looked at this man who had walked across a diner on Valentine's Day because he could not bring himself to stay in his seat. This man who had worked night shifts for 3 weeks and said nothing about it. This man who had listened to her talk about her brother for 2 hours on the phone the night they met and asked her to keep going. This man who had sat on the floor of Elijah's room and simply stayed. She said yes before he finished his last sentence. Not because the moment was perfect, not because she was supposed to, because it was him. Because he was exactly who he had shown himself to be from the beginning, and she was done being surprised by it and done running from it. He stood up. She pulled him in and held on. Behind them the city moved through its January Saturday. Somewhere down the block a car passed with music on. The oak trees on the corner had lost their leaves and stood bare and patient against the silver sky. The way things stand when they are waiting for the season to change. They got married in May. Deja had said it quietly in January, a few days after the sidewalk, while they were eating breakfast, that she wanted May. Not because May was convenient, because she wanted to put something new in that month, not to cover the grief, not to pretend the 5th of May was anything other than what it was, but to add to it, layer something living over the loss. The way Elijah had explained once, about the compositions he loved most, that the best music lets you hear everything that came before in what's happening now. The ceremony was in Darnell's backyard. 37 people, the shop, the congregation at Mount Zion, Deja's colleagues from the non-profit, Kezia in a yellow dress she had purchased specifically and without apology, and which was exactly right. Zara stood beside Deja in deep plum, the color she had chosen herself, walking her role with a composure that cost her something to maintain and which she managed until the vows started. Theo Barnes was there. He stood to the side with his bass and did not say much to anyone, which was how Theo was at most gatherings outside of the music. But when Deja came around the side of Darnell's house, the melody started low and warm, the kind of sound you feel settling in your chest before you hear it in your ears. Elijah had written it when Deja was 18 years old, had never performed it publicly, had titled it simply her name. Theo had spent 2 weeks learning it note for note from the recording. Deja in her ivory dress, fitted through the waist, the skirt moving as she walked. Her hair in a silk press that fell past her shoulders, loose, the way she wore it when the day was worth the effort. A single gardenia pinned near her temple, white against dark. She was 37 years old, and she looked, in that afternoon light, like a woman who had come through something and knew it and was not diminished by the knowing. Calvin was standing under the oak tree at the far end of the yard, and when he heard the bass line, his face did something he made no effort to manage. He let it. A chair sat at the front, empty. On the seat was a photograph Elijah mid-performance, mouth open in a laugh, taken at the Tuesday residency on Auburn Avenue years before the diagnosis. Beside the photograph, his trumpet. Deja had found it when she cleared his apartment and had kept it without knowing yet what she was keeping it for. Now she knew. She walked past the chair and touched the bell of the trumpet with 2 fingers, briefly, the way you touch something that is both gone and still completely present. Then she walked to Calvin. The vows were short, not because there wasn't more to say. Because the most important things between them had already been said in apartments and diners and kitchen floors and on a sidewalk in January. The vows were just making it official. Calvin said, I stay, that's my whole vow. Everything else I'll figure out as I go. But I stay. Deja said, I used to think being strong meant carrying everything alone. You showed me it means knowing who to hold on to when you can't carry it anymore. I'm holding on to you. Kezia cried from the second row, without warning and without apology. Zara made it through the vows and then stopped trying. Darnell had something in his eye that he addressed with a handkerchief and did not discuss. Theo played until the light went gold. After, when the yard had filled with noise and the kind of warmth that comes from people who genuinely like each other, being in the same place together, Calvin and Deja stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment, her hand in his, the evening coming on soft and slow over the city. She said he would have had opinions about everything today. The food, Calvin said, especially the food, the music. He would have told Theo 3 specific things he should have done differently with the second movement. She smiled, and then said it was perfect. In that order, Calvin said. Always in that order. They stood there while the yard moved around them. Someone had put music on inside the house, and it drifted out through the open back door. Bill Evans, Waltz for Debbie, the live recording, 1961. The one with the room noise, glasses and low conversation in the background. The sound of people in a room together before they knew what was coming. Deja looked at Calvin. Did you, Zara? He said. She found it on my phone. Deja shook her head slowly, pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment. 11 months since a February evening when she had walked into Marigold Diner in a red dress. With her whole complicated life in her hands, and a man she had never met had walked across the room and sat down because he could not do anything else. Here, this yard, this man, this music, this life that had not been planned and could not have been and was, despite all of that, exactly right. 2 years on, Deja ran the Family Services division of the nonprofit. She had built a program that paired long-term caregivers with peer counselors, people who had done what she had done, and were willing to sit with someone still in the middle of it and say not it gets better, or it happens for a reason, but simply I know, which was the only thing she had learned that actually helped. Calvin was still at the shop. He and Darnell had started something new, 2 young men from the neighborhood, 19 and 21. Coming in 3 afternoons a week to learn the trade. Calvin had not announced it or made a program out of it. He had just started showing them things, because he had been given something, years ago, when Darnell had hired a 28-year-old who needed work and didn't say much, and you passed things forward when you could. That was all. Zara finished her degree and came home to Atlanta. Took a position at a design studio downtown and found an apartment 6 blocks from her father's house, which she said was purely coincidental and which no one believed. They visited Elijah's grave on the first Sunday of every month, brought flowers when Deja remembered to buy them, which was most months. Sat for a while. Sometimes one of them said something and sometimes they didn't need to. Theo came with them sometimes. He would stand back a little, the way he stood back at gatherings, and then after a few minutes he would say something about Elijah. That none of them had known a story from a Tuesday night on Auburn Avenue. An argument about chord progressions, a joke Elijah had told at 2 in the morning after a long set that Theo still found funny 15 years later, and Deja would listen and file it away in the place where she kept everything Elijah had ever been, which was full and getting fuller, not emptier, the way she had been afraid it would go. The last Sunday of April, Zara came with them and stood at the headstone for a long moment before she said anything. Then, I didn't get as much time with you as I wanted, but I know who you made us be. So, thank you for that. The April sun came through the oak tree above them and moved on the grass. Calvin put his arm around Deja. Zara stood close on her other side. Deja put her hand flat on the stone, said what she said every month, quietly. Just for him. We're good, Eli. A breath. We're really, really good. The light moved through the branches. The city went on doing what cities do. And the 3 of them stood there in the good April warmth, not fixing anything, not solving anything. Just there. Which had always, it turned out, been enough.